Hi, everyone. I'm Vladimir Duthier. Anne-Marie Green will join me in just a moment. We begin this hour, though, in Pittsburgh, where the last of the 11 victims in a mass shooting in a synagogue is being laid to rest today. People are now gathering to pay their final respects to 97-year-old Rose Mallinger. She was the oldest person killed in the attack last Saturday. Earlier today, our David Begnaud spoke with one of the survivors of the shooting. Carol Black escaped the synagogue by hiding in a dark storage room. Her brother, sadly, Richard Gottfried, was killed. She described hiding as Bowers gunned down members of the congregation.
I think the first shots in our area were he went into the kitchen, so there was an entrance into the kitchen at the bottom of the steps, and he heard their voices, so he knew there were people in there, and he went in and shot them. And
one of those people
was my brother. My brother and Dan Stein was the other one. They were, the three we lost were enormously important to the congregation. So I think the time that he spent shooting them actually is what gave us the time to escape the room. And to me, they're martyrs. They gave us the time so that we're still here.
It's such a beautiful sentiment. And David Begnaud is joining us on the phone now from Pittsburgh. David, what a moving interview you conducted there with Ms. Black. I mean, just the fact that she seems, it's hard to believe that just a few days after this massacre that she's able to put that feeling into context.
Well, Vlad, she buried her brother, Richard Gottlieb, yesterday. And I'm always struck at how people process grief differently. Mm-hmm. Not everybody cries. Some people might laugh, right, because of the nerves in the moment. Mm-hmm. Miss Black was so incredibly composed as she sat there and she walked through the fact that she arrived a little late. She was on her phone, sat down, waited for the service to begin, and her brother was in the kitchen catching up with a friend of his. And all of a sudden she heard something that she said sounded like a metal table falling on a tile floor. And she didn't think much of it initially. She thought somebody in the kitchen dropped something, and then she heard it again. And she said at that point the rabbi knew what it was. And so he started to hurdle. Rabbi Perlman started to, get everyone in to this closet area, and there she went with another man whose name is Barry Werber and another man named Melvin Wax. And it was Mr. Waxflad who at some point, according to Carol, Melvin Wax stuck his head outside the closet, if you will, to kind of look around. And Mr. Wax was shot and killed. And she said she could hear Melvin Wax taking his final breaths. And she said what felt like an hour was probably 20 minutes as she just sat there in the dark. And the gunman actually went right in front of the closet. And she said, we saw his shadow. She said he didn't utter a word, and we dare not say anything. But they just sat there. They sat there until the SWAT team came in to get them. And she recounted being hurtled out. And I found this interesting. She said there was a SWAT officer in front of them and one behind them because the SWAT team didn't want them to get shot in the back as they exited. And they got out the building, and she kept saying to them, my brother's in there, my brother's in there. And she said, my head was telling me that it's probably, he probably got shot. But she said, my heart kept telling me, you got to tell him my brother's in there. Let him know. They can go back and get him. And they found out at about 10 o'clock that night from the medical examiner that her brother was shot and killed.
Wow. Even listening to you describing what she told you and the interview that you conducted, it is hard for any of us to imagine going through something like that, let alone coming out of it in one piece. She is now well aware that Bowers has pleaded not guilty, that he wants a trial by jury. What was her reaction to that, if she had one?
Ooh, that may have been some of the strongest reactions she gave. She said she basically called him, and I don't have the exact word she used in front of me, but she called him worthless and not worthy of what she felt she doesn't even want to think about him, is what she said. And I specifically said to her, the prosecution wants to seek the death penalty. Would you like for him to get the death penalty? And she says he doesn't deserve it because that would be too easy. I want him to spend the rest of his life in prison. She seemed particularly galled that he pleaded not guilty. I also asked her about the president. You know, President Trump came to Pittsburgh against the wishes of a lot of people who thought it was too soon and who just didn't like the presence of the president who, you know, of course has a reputation for being, you know, divisive, according to some, in terms of his rhetoric. And I asked her what she thought, and she was very happy that the president came. In fact, she said her sister-in-law, her brother's widow, met with the president and found him to be incredibly consoling and just really kind. And so she said, I am so happy he came. It was appropriate that he came, and I'm honored that he came.
That is a good way to remind people that the president, sometimes in that political rhetoric, as you say, David, will, just like all presidents before him, find it within his heart to be the consoler in chief, which is so important in these troubling times. So I want to ask you another question about her brother, David. How does she hope the world will remember him and the 10 others who were killed?
Well, you know, it's interesting. So Mr. Gottlieb was Dr. Gottlieb. He was a dentist. His wife is a dentist. And as she explained it to me, they were going to retire fairly soon. They had done a lot of humanitarian work in their community, a lot of volunteering. And she mentioned that Dr. Gottlieb had ended up going back to synagogue and sort of rekindling his faithful reverence, if you will, after their father passed away. And it brought him back to the synagogue. And she said, I kind of followed my brother. We got back into it, if you will. And so, Vlad, I think the best way to answer that question is how she ended the interview. She stood up and we shook hands. And again, I found her so incredibly strong. And she looked at me and she said, how do you sum up a life of more than 60 years in a television interview? And I thought that's well said. Right? How do you sum up the goodness that someone's done over more than 60 years in a brief interview?
Wow. Finally, David, let me just ask you about this being the start of the Sabbath. It is the first Sabbath for the Jewish community since the shooting. We know that all across America, no matter what your faith, people will be keeping those that were massacred in their thoughts and in their prayers. How is the Tree of Life Synagogue planning to celebrate Shabbat?
Good question. Have not heard. And quite frankly, one of the reasons is because the rabbi of the synagogue has been so busy with the funeral services this week. So we haven't gotten really any details as to how they're going to celebrate. You should know that the synagogue is still a crime scene. It's still roped off in police tape. So really the only activity happening at the synagogue are mourners going to stand before the 11 stars of David and the flowers with the candles. And police have set up barricades now. So, and Vlad, people are coming from all over. I mean, I met a family from New York City, a man who brought his wife and his 5 kids because he called it a teachable moment. He wanted them to be there. And I, in fact, saw them at one of the funerals. He said, we don't know this person. We're just coming to pay our respects. So people are really coming from near and far. But as of right now, the rabbi who might coordinate services, if you will, he's been so busy, as you said. Miss Rose is being buried today. And that will be the last of the 11 victims to be buried. There was one victim buried in a private memorial service, but today's funeral of Rose Mallinger concludes it.
That's such an important point that you make, and an anecdote to recount to our audience, David, because as we've seen, there has been a significant rise in anti-Semitic attacks in this country, and to have a father come from afar to show his child what has happened in Pittsburgh and describe it as a teachable moment, it certainly gives you hope. David Begnaud, thank you so much for calling in. I know you're really busy. Great interview. I'm looking forward to more tonight on the Evening News. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you. And you should know that there'll be more online and more tomorrow on CBS This Morning, Saturday.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.